It's very hard. It's very hard to say no to Nora when she asks. And so it's a pleasure to be here this evening. And just for the record, I have been an Ignatian volunteer for about 7 years. And during that time, I've been privileged to serve on the pastoral care team at St. Elizabeth's Rehabilitation and Nursing Center with John Menninger, who's also on this evening. But I think Nora asked me to be the moderator tonight because of my work pre-retirement, where I practiced law for 30 years in the field of affordable housing. And since retirement, I also continue to be engaged in affordable housing issues. I'm actually a member of the Board of Commissioners of the Howard County Housing Commission, and I'm also on the steering committee of the Howard County Housing Affordability Coalition. But the goal this evening is to acquire a better understanding of what I would call the enormity of the affordable housing problem. And hopefully, during the course of the evening, maybe we can dare together to dream of how we can achieve housing for all. And I'd like to think of one analogy which I think may describe this affordable housing crisis facing our country. And it's to think of it as a kind of a patchwork quilt or a crazy quilt, because it encompasses so many issues that we've been trying to patch over. You can see some of them. If you look at the screen now, there's a statistic about 6.8 million rental homes that were short for people who of low income across our country. That's just one of the statistics. There's also a subsidy waiting list, a national waiting list for people. There are 2.3 million people receiving housing subsidies in our nation, but there are millions more on the waiting list. And frankly, the waiting list takes 2.5 years to get off on average. And some people wait as long as 10 years. And of course, during that time, people are homeless, they're underhoused, they're in overcrowded conditions. And then there's the problem of housing cost. It may be hard to believe, but 3.2 million families in America pay more than 50% of their income for rent, which means they don't have enough money, for food, for medicines. And then there's homelessness. There are more than 500,000 people on average who are homeless on any given night in the United States. And of that number, 170,000 are families with children, and 34,000 are unaccompanied youth. We can think of these broad statistics as describing a kind of a national problem that really is a crazy patchwork quilt. But you look at it locally, here in Howard County, where I have some familiarity, there are 6,500 we're short 6,500 affordable units. There are 7,300 families in Howard County paying more than half of their income for rent. And this is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. And on any given night, there can be up to 500 kids who are couch surfing or without a stable home in our county trying to go to school. And what we need to think about and remember as we go through this evening is that each of those statistics, whether it's millions or thousands or hundreds, represents a human face, an elderly face, the face of someone disabled, a child, a working family. All are children of God, everyone facing the challenge of obtaining decent, safe, and affordable housing. And that brings with it not only family stability, but better public health, better education. So much comes out of having decent, safe housing. Tonight, we are so fortunate, so blessed to have with us 3 of the most incredible people we could ever have to discuss this issue with us. Amy McCLAIN from Ballard, Spahr, who works in the field of affordable housing law. Mike Mitchell with Luminus, the Network for New Americans, who has headed up this nonprofit which works with immigrant populations in search of housing. And JOAB with St. Ambrose Housing Aid Center, which is probably one of the premier nonprofits working in the field of affordable housing in Baltimore. These 3 people have not only decided to share their experience with us and their insights, but we need to understand they are devoted professionals who, I think I was adding this up, probably together have more than 70 to 80 years in the field of affordable housing. I won't say which has the oldest and which is the shortest, but collectively, they're an incredible group of people, very devoted and very dedicated. So think about what they're going to be telling us and learning from that experience. And as the evening progresses, and as they present, if you have questions that come to mind, jot them into the chat. When you jot them in, we'll make sure they get addressed at the end. We want to make sure all the issues are addressed. So that as they come to mind, just type them in. We will begin the presentations with a brief interlude, a reflective interlude, which will help focus us. And after the 3 presentations are over, we'll have another moment of interlude before we begin our questions and answers and our dialogue with our 3 presenters. So to begin the evening first, we'll turn to Elaine Ireland, our spiritual director, for a brief reflective interlude.
So just consider these few things that I'm going to put up on the screen, that we're going to put up on the screen for a way of grounding yourself as we listen to the speakers tonight. The Catholic bishops believe decent, safe, and affordable housing is a human right, and that communities and government have an obligation to ensure the housing needs of all are met, especially poor and vulnerable people and their families. So this is our church's stance, the USCCB's stance on housing and homelessness. So I invite you to just take a moment, 30 seconds or so, and think about, how do you define the word home? What images or adjectives come to mind when you think of the word home? And now I ask you to think about how you define the word homelessness. Is it just about shelter, or is it the lack of those things we associate with home? Do you believe that decent housing is a human right? Decent, safe housing is a human right. I'll turn it back over to Paul now to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. And our first speaker tonight is Amy McCLAIN. We are really fortunate to have Amy with us. She is a partner at the law firm of Ballard, Spahr, which is one of the premier affordable housing law firms in the country. Amy has headed up that practice and represents literally dozens and dozens and dozens of governmental agencies across the country dealing with affordable housing finance and affordable housing development. And she's going to look at this issue from the perspective of a national actor who looks at what federal, state, and local governments can do, help us to understand the severity of the problem, and point to possible solutions. So Amy, thank you for being with us tonight, and the floor or the TV screen is yours. Computer screen is yours.
Thank you. My virtual platform. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm happy to be here and talk with all of you. I've been doing this work, and thanks to Paul, in large part. He helped introduce me to this area of work when I was a law student and yet still a youth minister at the Church of the Resurrection in Ellicott City. But I've been practicing law for almost 20 years at this point, and have been spending most of my time, on almost all of it, in the housing world. And just a little bit of history. The nation entered into the area of trying to provide for affordable housing as a response to the housing shortages of the Great Depression in the 30s. And there was a passage of the United States Housing Act of 1937. And so when you look around the country, many of our housing authorities and even some of our housing dates to the 40s as a result of that US Housing Act of 1937. And you'll also notice that a lot of the housing was originally built as a way of housing workers So workforce housing was public housing, and it was focused on developing hard units, actual units, where people could live within that unit as long as they needed, and when they no longer needed it, move on and make it available to someone else. These units, oftentimes Paul and I spent a lot of time redeveloping them across the country. A lot of them were considered wartime housing, meant to house people who were working in shipyards and other industries to help support the United States in the World War II effort. And so they were almost barrack style type of housing. So it was not intended to be anything too extensive, but the bare minimum. So it's focused on providing shelter. And that housing oftentimes fell into disrepair because there had been a lack of ongoing financial investment from the federal government as time went along. And so you would see a shortage of of those resources to help maintain and ensure that the housing was continue to meet the housing quality standards that we would expect. And oftentimes the housing was located in areas that were not necessarily the best communities. They would suffer from environmental conditions, be sited near, say, train tracks, or lacking access to public transportation or to jobs, notwithstanding the workforce housing where it was initially intended. But when those jobs dried up, they were then isolated. And so it quickly became apparent that we needed to do more than just house people. We needed to house them in communities that were vibrant and connected and part of the greater fabric of the community. Part of the effort to try and address that was given a major boost with the Tax Reform Act of 1986, when Congress passed the low-income housing tax credit. It's an element within the U.S. Internal Revenue Code that allows for a credit against one's income taxes when they make investments in certain types of affordable housing. And the housing is for those who earn incomes at or below 60% of the area median income. But we should give thought to who are really the truest poor. 60%, those with incomes at or below 60%, at about 60% of the area median income, are almost workforce housing. They're at the upper the upper edge, if you will, of poverty. The greatest poverty are those who are very low income, those at or below 30% of the area median income. And that's where we find a great need. Oftentimes, we cannot house people who are at that level of poverty without some additional subsidy to go along with it. So the tax credit to help build units, which supplement the public housing units that are out there, in and of itself is not enough. There needs to be some kind of subsidy to go along with it. And we've learned that having that subsidy in and of itself is not enough. We need to have supportive services that provide the wraparound support and engagement for residents, providing job training, educational opportunities, access to work, access to childcare, all of the things that allow the home to be a foundation for something greater. And so that's where I think over time we've seen affordable housing move. And there have been a number of initiatives spurred, I think, initially, or the big boost was with the low-income housing tax credit. But there was also something called QARA, the Quality Housing and what's the R in that, Paul? Quality Housing and QHWRA, but essentially it did a major revamping of affordable housing, allowing housing authorities to do things that it could not do before, being more creative and innovative, not just about building and owning public housing, but how can you engage with the greater community, private sector, to bring in additional funds and additional creative approaches to doing what we're doing. And it also involved some significant breakthroughs on combining different financing sources. So bonds, oftentimes localities can issue tax exempt bonds and support the development of affordable housing. And it gave housing authorities and affordable housing developers tools to become as creative as they could. And over the years, we've had the opportunity to work with some housing authorities that are extremely challenged, that have significant needs. And if you think about Baltimore City, for example, it used to be that the towers, if you recall, the public housing towers that used to ring downtown Baltimore, those were slowly demolished and redeveloped as a mixture of mixed income housing. And we are 20, almost approaching 30 years into that effort. And it has been generally successful. It's definitely much better than what it was, but there are also some shortcomings. So we look at that time and see how far it has helped us be innovative and creative and really understand that it is about the housing, but it's also about access to the services. And so the supportive services that go along with it. And also ensuring that we think about those who may not necessarily qualify for the assisted housing because they are not legal citizens. They're considered illegal immigrants and so therefore not eligible. Or they may have had some criminal history, and I think the country is doing much better at alleviating that issue and allowing those with criminal backgrounds to access housing. But I wanted the other creative innovations that come to mind in Portland, Oregon, for example. They developed something called the Resource Access Center. And it was essentially the combination of single room occupancy units. So people who were chronically homeless and needed the supportive wraparound services to not only access the housing, but to be successful as someone who lived in the housing, having not had sort of that experience before and maybe not being comfortable with it, giving them the services that they needed to be successful, if you will, in their unit, as well as a day shelter center that gave residents people who were not housed, who were chronically homeless, but not yet ready to live in a unit, access to a shower, a place to leave their dog when they went for a job interview, someplace to pick up their mail. And it was 2 buildings adjacent to each other. And it required really creative financing techniques and tools. And so it was one of the hopeful things for me in the work that we do, because it showed how communities can collaborate and work together across agencies and in a way that is not deterred by the challenges that different restrictions may impose, funding limitations, and then the challenges of serving populations that have faced a lot of trauma and difficulties in their lives and how to overcome that. So that kind of work has been very fulfilling and engaging and gives us hope that we can do something on a large scale to address that population's needs.
Thank you, Amy. And I mean, one of the things it's encouraging from what I hear is that there are ways to combine services and housing and shelter to help people become more independent and capable. And there's a bright future.
Right.
Is there anything you want to add before we move to Mike?
Yeah, so the brightest future is, the Biden administration and the infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better legislation that was recently passed and passed on to the White House for signature. That involves an extensive amount of funding, and it's the single greatest investment in affordable housing, greater than what was invested during the as a part of the U.S. Housing Act in the late 30s. And it will allow us to develop 1 million more affordable housing, home units, not home ownership units, but home units. So it's the greatest investment that we have seen. And in talking with people at HUD, I think they get a little giddy almost, thinking about all the different things that they could do with that amount of funding. And it is a bit overwhelming for somebody who's been very busy with there's a lot of activity. If that's any, it's, I think, gratifying or exciting. It's very busy, and there are a lot of things being developed, and there's a lot of action in the community nationwide. And there's a greater emphasis on trying to build housing in communities that are well located, that are free from environmental hazards, that are close to jobs, sort of the whole environmental social justice governance type, the ESG push that's very prevalent right now in our communities is becoming essential to what we're doing. And the evolution from simply just public housing as hard units to creative, affordable housing financed with private investment, now to investment in housing and communities through something called the Choice Neighborhoods Act, or Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, where it's not just about the housing, but it's about the schools and public safety issues and access to economic development, that sort of thing. So things are evolving, and there's always hope that we will continue to evolve. That's not to say that we won't continue to face challenges, but there are lots of new opportunities.
But it sounds like there are some good creative patches for putting onto that patchwork.
That patch, yes.
Good patches. Thank you, Amy. And now we turn to Mike. And we're fortunate to have Mike with us this evening. Mike is, as you know, from looking at the screen, the head of Luminus, which is a nonprofit devoted to assisting new Americans in a variety of problems that they face, including housing. But before going to Luminus, Mike spent a decade with Chesapeake Chesapeake Habitat, which was actually building housing with sweat equity in Baltimore City. Mike brings a lot of experience and a lot of insight and an extraordinary dedication to the field of affordable housing. And we're really fortunate to have his insights and to hear his experience and hopefully some more attractive, helpful patches that we can put on this patchwork quilt, Mike.
You bet, Paul. Thank you so much for having me tonight. It's good to see all of you. It's good to say hello as well to Peggy Fry, who is a volunteer with us at Luminus, and we are grateful to have her as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about housing, but I'm also going to talk about how housing intersects with human services. And I'm going to do that through the lens of immigration. So I want to start by just asking you to think, actually, Elaine really captured this, but think about a house versus a home. I put in here a quote that relates to the first story. So I want to tell you the story of Gloria. Gloria is a woman that lived in Guatemala, a rural part of Guatemala. She started helping out a doctor in this small town, and she started making money, and she used that money to buy a home, to actually build a home. And after a while, the gang started to see that she was making some money. So they started extorting money from her. And Gloria eventually said to the doctor, I don't know what I'm going to do. They keep taking more and more money every month. Eventually, the gangs came to her and they said, either you give us your complete paycheck or we'll kill your 2 sons. So what she did is she left. She fled. She's one of these people that came to the border. She left her home, and she found out months later that the gangs completely destroyed her home. So she came to the United States with nothing. And that's a story about how she lost her house, but she brought her home with her by bringing her sons. Now, if you go to the next slide, a word about Luminus. Luminus helps people like Gloria every day. And the way we look at immigration is that the immigrant story is the American story rooted in the idea that all new Americans bring richness and value to American life. Now, this is an aspiration, and anyone that looks at equity and some of the challenges in this country knows that that is an aspiration, but it's something that we seek. But this is so important, going back to housing. And if you look at the next slide, right now, there are 1 billion people around the world on the move. Those people are crossing borders and seeking safety. There are 4 trends contributing to it. But if those billion people are seeking a safe place to live, how will we welcome them? Now, this is just a sample list of scenarios. One of the biggest influencers is going to be climate change, and we already see it, whether or not people. And these 4 scenarios offer how we as society will respond. Will we collaborate and cooperate and all end up in the Arctic in 200 years? Will we be barbarians at the gate? The decisions that we make today, whether it's a Build Back Together plan, whatever it is, are going to contribute to our future. And that's so important because if you go to the next slide, you'll see these forces through pictures. So you look at the top left, what's happening right now in Ethiopia. If you've ever been to the DC area, you see many Ethiopians, there's a large Ethiopian community there because of prior civil wars. You know that there's a big Haitian community actually on the eastern shore of Maryland. And of course, we can't forget about Afghanistan. I put the Maryland flag there because Maryland was founded as home for people fleeing persecution, Catholics fleeing persecution. And it's really important to think about that in context of tonight's discussion. So what can we do about it? If you go to the next slide, you'll see that what is so important is that since the beginning of the pandemic, prices of houses have increased by 18%. Many people, especially those that are low income, who have lost employment, have lost steady income, are only now depending and getting jobs back, but are deeply in debt. Now, there's been help from the federal government through eviction assistance. But what we want to do as a nonprofit organization is think about how people bring wealth to the picture. And when I say wealth, I don't mean money. I mean that immigrants, as well as all populations, can actually bring something to the housing picture. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see another way of looking at it. We as a society, American society, too often sees the needs of the poor, of migrants, et cetera, as taking something, as we need more housing, and that is a problem. And it shouldn't be offered. There are some in America that believe that. But if we were able to look and change the paradigm to say that housing organizations like Habitat for Humanity and that St. Ambrose Housing Aid Center could actually see and provide wraparound services for migrants and the poor, we can see that those people, when they get jobs and when they get stable lives, can actually contribute back by being able to afford to pay a rent, to pay a mortgage. So when you drive through Baltimore next time and you see thousands of vacant houses, ask yourselves about the policy questions, but also ask yourselves about what we are doing as a society to equip people to get capital, to learn workforce development, to get access to childcare, that these are not quote unquote socialist things. These are actually capitalist things that look at the richness of humans. And we are compelled by faith and sought by Christ to do and to see this mission. And if you go to the final slide, there's just a final gospel quote where Jesus talks about a kingdom divided. And this will certainly resonate with, I'm sure Lincoln thought about this when he spoke about the Civil War. But we as a society right now, until we can think about the other as us, that is only when we will be able to create transformation in our communities and our society. And so it is not just about housing, it's about homes and how we welcome people to into our homes. So that homes are not a figurative, they're not a literal thing alone, but they are a community thing. And by welcoming people into our homes, we lead to welcoming them to actually owning homes, to owning houses, and transforming society. So I'll just close with this, a story that faced us just a few weeks ago, and you can close the slides, Nora. 2 weeks ago, was brought to our attention, there was a Haitian woman in Howard County who was homeless. She had an 8-year-old daughter, and that 8-year-old daughter was not even enrolled in school. She was offered housing by a man who said that if you sleep with me, I will give you a room in my place and I will let you enroll your daughter in school. And this Haitian woman said, hell no, I'm not doing that. She ended up with Luminus. We are not, a crisis provider, but through our network and through collaboration with other nonprofits, we were able to find this Haitian woman a home. And it was because of partnerships. And that 8-year-old is now enrolled in school and has a safer, more stable life because the community came together to do something about it. So when you think about housing and you think about housing organizations and the housing crisis, always be thinking about how the nonprofits in our greater community can contribute to that web of support to give people that wealth. Again, not wealth in terms of money, but wealth in terms of social and economic capital for where they'll work and what they'll be able to afford to do, to in turn transform society. That is our mission at Luminus. And it's what we believe, we as a community, that all of you as people who are in some way related to IVC can make a difference. Maybe you're doing that right now as a volunteer, but how you can do it as an advocate and a participant in the different organizations where you get involved. So thank you, and thank you, Paul, and thank you, Nora.
Thank you, Mike. And I suspect that one thing we can explore in the dialogue is how you see us being able to contribute to overcoming those challenges. You've challenged us well in your presentation, and thank you for that. And actually, you're mentioning the role that nonprofits can play is a nice segue to our friend GERARD. And so the next presentation is from JOAB. GERARD brings with him his experience at St. Ambrose Housing Aid Center, which, as I mentioned, is one of the leading nonprofits, not just in Baltimore, but in Maryland, dealing with issues of affordable housing in a variety of ways. And before coming to St. Ambrose, he was with the with LIHC, which is the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which I think GERARD is probably, if not the largest, one of the largest investors in affordable housing development in the country.
That's correct.
And so he brings that wealth of experience as well. And we're fortunate to have him and to have him share his experience with us, telling us about the impact of St. Ambrose in the city and what he sees as potential solutions to the problems that we face with affordable housing. So GERARD, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's good to be here. So St. Ambrose Housing Aid Center was founded 53 years ago by a Jesuit priest named Vinnie Quayle, who served at St. Ambrose Church in Park Heights. And the mission of our organization is to create and maintain equal housing opportunities for low and moderate income people, primarily in Baltimore City, and to encourage and support strong and diverse neighborhoods. And when you talk about what is a home, it doesn't extend to the building as we have discovered tonight. It talks about a neighborhood, it talks about employment, it talks about life, it talks about love, and all these things, friendships, is all part of what a home is. And it is a right for everyone to have those experiences of home. It's interesting in our history, when Vinnie created an organization, he thought the housing problem would have gone away in 10 years. And here we are today, still seeing that housing problem. And over the years, our organization has taken on a very different look than most organizations do that are working in housing. We have a variety of housing services that we provide to families in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and extend wherever there's military personnel who has that domicile here in Baltimore or in Maryland, we can provide services to them as well. So the challenges you've heard about by the other speakers and by Paul, giving a little bit of the statistics around housing. But one of the key ones that I like to talk about is the cost burden. Is that 33% of families in Baltimore City are cost burden, meaning that they cannot afford their homes. They cannot afford to rent. They cannot afford to own. They're not necessarily unemployed. They're employed, but they're just cost burden. They cannot survive with the income that they're making. And many of our families, that's what we find within the homeless community. I think the stigma of homelessness is very differently. Stigma of cost burden or poverty is thought about differently. but it really is about people who are trying to survive and trying to be productive citizens within the community. I'll talk a little bit about some of the programming of our organization. So we have the typical ones. We own 310 units of rental housing. It doesn't sound very large, but 129 of those are single family homes throughout Baltimore City and Baltimore County. That's the challenging part. 129 houses spread over a wide area, and we provide, we own the property, we self-manage the property, and we provide case management services for a number of those families. So it is, we are a little bit different than most housing entities. 30 of our homes in our rental portfolio are public housing residents. 26 of them, 26 families are shelter plus care families. So we provide, they're formerly homeless, folks who are HIV positive, who have some kind of recovery, drug or alcoholism recovery, or have some disability that prevents them from working, physical or mental. We have 11 of our apartments are house formerly homeless youth, which is very different and very new for us. We started our involvement in housing homeless youth through about 3 years ago in one of our programs that I'll talk about in a little bit. And we started moving those homeless young people once they are settled and have case management into rental properties that we own. The average tenancy for our families is 6 years. 82% of them are female head of households, and 190 children call our rental homes their home. We also do single family for sale homes for low and moderate income family. And yes, we range from between 40% of medium income to around 63% of medium income, or as high as we go for our families who purchase from us. Over the years, we have done about 855 housing units, homes that in communities in the Northeast Baltimore area. And those are terrific homes. For our 50th anniversary, we were able to find a person who bought our first home and was still living in Bella Edison, which is tremendously amazing that that home can survive with that individual, with that family still residing there. So that's another way that we provide services to our population. Then we have a number of other programs that are not traditional housing programs. When St. Ambrose started, we had one attorney either volunteering with us, and then we had that attorney, we hired an attorney somewhere around 1982 to come on staff to provide services to families, because we realized going through the court system needs to be protected, and it needs to be accessible to the families that we serve. And when I came on board in 2011, I thought that was just the most amazing thing to have legal representation within an organization. And pretty quickly, we expanded that one attorney to a legal services. So now we have 4 attorneys within our agency, and we get same-day representation to clients who are coming in for help either accessing or maintaining housing. We have broadened that a little bit, not only to include maintaining and accessing housing, but creating generational wealth, passing on their home as an asset to the next generation, preserving that home within that family, as well as establishing community strength within moving that asset from one member of the family to another. And I think that's one of the future within housing is not, we have to have a plethora of resources and programs that address this need. It just cannot be the traditional way of supporting housing. We have to think creatively as we move as we move ahead in solving this huge challenge. So that's one of the newer programs that we have. And then we have a program that started 35 years ago called home sharing or shared housing. So shared housing is a national movement that has a number of models. Ours is a home sharing program, and it started out as an aging in place where a senior may have a property that they would like to bring in someone into their home, either to provide a level of service for them or as a affordable rental, and to become a part of that family. Over the past 35 years, our program has grown. We have 250 seniors or individuals who have opened up their homes to another individual. The average price point for rent is around $500 a month. The average age of our home provider, the individual who owns the home, is 64. The average age of our home seeker, someone coming in to live with that person, is 57. 50% of our clients are over 55. 66% of the clients are female. The median income for the home provider, the individual that owns the home, is $26,000. The median income for the home seeker is $9,000. The longest match that we have currently going is 31 years. It's a fellow that lives in New Jersey and works here in Maryland, and he lives here during the week and goes back to New Jersey on the weekend. The average length of a match is 18 months. The average time a home provider remain in our program is 8 years. And the average number of matches made by a home provider is at average around five different people that they bring into their home while they're in the program. This is an extraordinary program in all accounts, and we continue to expand on it. But if you think about it, that someone could pay $500 a month for an average of 18 months in a home for a period of over 8 years, and we have 250 families or individuals who have agreed to do this, it makes a huge difference of achieving affordable housing without having the traditional programs in it. It's something that stands. There's no public support for it. It's not subsidized by anyone, just by wonderful people who open up their homes to someone else. Over the years, we have added cohorts. I talked about our homeless youth. When we first started thinking about homeless youth, I thought if the first year we had 3 people who could open up their homes to taking a young person into their home from homelessness, that would be amazing. The first year we had 13. 13 families opened their homes, and since then we have added more as we have moved along. We also looked at our senior population and wanted to do something with them. And one of the cohorts that we do have, we have a small cohort of grandmoms who are raising a grandchild, and they are being housed by another single person who provides some support for the child. And so we have a lot of teachers in that cohort that provide some service to the child, either by helping them with homework, teaching music, those type of things, or as simple as picking up the child after school while the parent is at work. So it's another creative way of utilizing resources that already exist in the community and adds value to a family. Lastly, we're working on a project to house returning citizens using this home sharing strategy. We've just started, we started about 8 months ago. The ABLE Foundation is really excited about it and has offered us a lot of help within the planning stage. And we hope that we'll be able to do it. We're working with the Department of Corrections in the state of Maryland, DHCD, and we hope that we can generate something with this. The challenge here, though, is not necessarily, for us anyway, is not the house. It's the living wage for folks that are coming out of prison is one. And then how do you sustain that individual by giving them support around them in addition to what the homeowner or our program can provide. So that's an exciting thing, I think, and something, a challenge that we would like to undertake if we get through the pilot program and can able to expand on the program as we move along. Lastly, I just want to share my story, which is a immigrant story and someone who helped my family. So my parents came to Baltimore in 1967, and they ended up in Park Heights, and they were welcomed to St. Ambrose Church in Park Heights, where Vinnie Coyle was a seminarian and a priest. And that was our entrance into the United States through St. Ambrose Church. And then when my sister and I moved here with our parents a couple of years later, we too was enfolded in St. Ambrose Church. So just think about it. So here we are, 45 years later. I'm working at St. Ambrose now, where Vinnie Quayle was created St. Ambrose, the organization. St. Ambrose was a huge part in my life as growing up, and continues to be that today. And our story as an immigrant family coming here, being enfolded by a community, is one that changed my life, obviously, and has done many things for our family. If you were looking for something to do or some way to make a difference, I'm living proof that just making a connection with a family, in loving them, enfolding them, and bringing them into a community is a wonderful way of doing it. And you never know what will happen 45 years later. So thanks so much for having me. It's been a tremendous opportunity for me to share the St. Ambrose story and my story with you.
What an inspiring story. Thank you, Gerard. And ironically, I think you just very powerfully illustrated what Mike was talking about, which was look at the opportunities that are created when you see immigrant populations as people that you can invest in our community and can return their contributions when we give them the opportunities to do so. And it's been an inspiring evening hearing from you and Mike and Amy. And I will say that there are encouraging signs from everything that you've all said. Before looking at the questions, and there are a number of them, I will first want to thank you all. This was a very rich sharing of extraordinary level of knowledge, experience, and stories. And I think we all walk away with at least achieving our first goal, which is to better understand this very complex, enormous problem and to try to make it approachable. But before we do the Q&A, we're going to do another moment of reflection. And I turn it over to Elaine again to lead us in that moment.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. This picture that you see here is some of the housing that St. Ambrose has worked on in Baltimore City, renovating some of the dilapidated buildings and providing nice, safe, and secure, decent housing. So we thank them for their work in our city. We are reminded in Scripture that Jesus didn't have a home. The foxes have lairs and the birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has no place where he may rest his head. And we know that the poor and the immigrant, these are Jesus in our midst. And we want to make sure that we provide Christ a place to stay. So I think this is a really good quote, hearkening back to this idea at home, something that Mike said too. The problem, this is from the Pope, he was speaking to a group of religious men and women. He said, the problem is not feeding the poor or clothing the naked or visiting the sick, but rather recognizing that the poor, the naked, the sick, prisoners, and the homeless have the dignity to sit at our table, to feel at home among us, to feel part of a family. This is a sign that the kingdom of heaven is in our midst, when they feel at home. And we feel at home with them. So just take a moment now and say, so what now? How do I respond to what I have heard? Is there anything that was said or something on a slide that can serve as lectio divina for you? What spoke to you? What perked your ears? What do you want to go back to? What now?
Thank you very much, Elaine, for giving us that reflection on this evening. And as we move into the dialogue, the questions and answers, keep in mind the words of our Holy Father. And what does it mean to create a home for those without a home, those in need of a home, and how can we do that? Well, the first question that I want to get to was asked about whether or not the problem is growing at a greater rate than we can seem to get a handle on. The question was, the homeless population is growing, people in need of housing continue to increase. Ironically, GERARD had talked to us about how Vinnie Quayle thought 50 years ago that this problem wouldn't last more than about 10 years. And here we are 50 years later, and we're looking at a $150 billion investment from the federal government to provide another 1 million units, and we're short by millions. So it seems that we may be trying to get our act together all the time with financing and laws, and we're already behind. What do you respond to that, Amy, GERARD, and Mike? What is that? Amy, what would be your comment?
Remembering to unmute myself. Something that I think you, Paul, reminded me is that as Mother Teresa and others, and from Scripture, is that the poor will always be with us. And so the problem will always be present, but we have to remain steadfast in how we are willing to embrace it and not be afraid of it, and to remain renewed and energetic in approaching the solutions that we bring to it. I do think there's added crisis given the pandemic. I don't think that we lack in political will, because there's been significant, I don't know about sufficient, but significant funding to stem needs for evictions and that sort of thing. The problem, though, sometimes is in the delivery and getting those resources out into the community. I know that in Maryland, for example, Maryland was recently dinged for not rapidly deploying those resources, and having friends in other parts of the country who are engaged in this type of work understand that that's not unique to Maryland. So we do have a significant issue in front of us, but I think when we dig deep and we advocate on behalf of the poor and on behalf of the homeless, we can make a difference. And there are some really amazing organizations locally, you know, St. Ambrose, for example, Luminus, for example, Habitat for Humanity. And then nationally, you have organizations like the National Low Income Housing Coalition that are doing significant work as it relates to assembling data, because we know data is very important to helping our politicians move forward, giving them the basis for making decisions, and advocating for that information, about that information. The other thing that is often emphasized is to welcome and encourage people to come together in community and to bring people out to see what we're doing. So the good work that St. Ambrose does, it's all about making sure that the word is shared and people know about that good work. Because in doing so, it's not only just the problem, because that can be overwhelming, but it is the fact that there's a solution and there are ways of addressing it.
It's good work to be done. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. So Gerard, what would you say? I mean, I think that's a lead into what your thoughts are.
Sure, absolutely. Look, I think we need to stop thinking of housing as a commodity and more of as a right of something that we have. More like education. Early education is something. I mean, it's not available to everyone currently as it should be, but we certainly are thinking about it a little differently. I think by treating it as a commodity, we put a price and then we start excluding people from neighborhoods and all those things. And we need to rethink that. We also need to look at different models for housing people. I think there are, certainly the ones that we have shared is looking at housing, how we house people differently, how we create opportunities to pass on the housing asset to a family member, to focus on the neighborhoods and sustaining the neighborhoods with people who want to be there and care. I want to care for those particular neighborhoods, and we just need to think of it. We need to think about it differently. I think one of the errors we made earlier on is not thinking about this additional services that that needs to be provided to families who are experiencing homelessness and why they're doing it. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we're made is not providing wraparound services around all types of houses, not just for people who are experiencing homelessness, but for people who are cost burdened as well, needs those type of services. And we need to think through that a little bit better, grow it, and provide additional services for families that are cost burdened or struggling to pay their rent or support themselves in a home.
Those are good suggestions. Thank you. And Mike, how would you add to the discussion?
I would say that housing is often seen as a supply problem, meaning that there is not enough supply. But if we transform our look at it from the demand side, if we prepare people to support that demand it sounds like Gerard's organization is doing huge investments in people outside of the house that can make a difference. And so organizations should think about, or communities should think about a housing strategy that's inclusive of the network of nonprofits. The second thing is that we should be thinking about donors, and I include the government, et cetera, should be putting out opportunities for funding that are not simply about housing, but are inclusive of the different services and should ask for outcomes of those different services. So I would say those are two things.
That, I'll just add that one of the things that I think all three of you are helping us see is that even though the problem is enormous and has so many dimensions, so many patches, you can't give up. You need to be able to produce what I think are positive efforts, and what it can be in house sharing, it can be in finding ways to provide wraparound services, it can be finding ways to welcome new Americans, but we have to do whatever we can as advocates and contributing. Now, there's another question that we have here, which is somebody might be able to answer this one quickly, but someone asked that at one point there was this urban homesteading program in Baltimore that allowed people to buy houses in the city with just a few dollars down, the dollar houses. And the question is there a program like that in continuing, or is there any effort to revive it? And I mean, do any of you have an answer to that? I turn to maybe GERARD first.
Yeah, so the dollar houses are a tough, and the challenge, I think, for buying a house that is abandoned or owned by the city, as we know, is does it have lead or not? And if you have lead remediation, it can be a disaster rather quickly. So I don't know if I would advocate for the dollar houses to come back in its form that it once was, because a lot of people got into challenges with the lead paint issue, and we're still seeing that and feeling that experience today.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, there are opportunities, though, to get properties into the right hands to provide the subsidy. I mean, lead subsidy has gone away in the state of Maryland. They don't provide it anymore, and that should not be. We should have ample lead subsidy, and to get those homes subsidized to be cleaned up, rehabilitated, and provided for a lower moderate income family of somebody who is cost burdened at a price that they can afford. And I don't necessarily think that I think it's risky to do the dollar houses again from selling it to individuals, because I think the risks are just too much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that advice.
And the dollar houses really, I think, I live in a neighborhood where there are some of the original dollar houses, and it's a result of the I-95 condemnations. There was this intention of running I-95 through downtown Baltimore. And so they condemned a lot of property, and the city had all this property that when they elected to then run a tunnel, they had these homes that were vacant that needed someone. And so people bought them and rehabbed them. And it wasn't really an affordable housing mechanism. It was a historic preservation tool, really, more than anything else. So I think that, those people took on lead paint issues because they may have had the means to manage that sort of thing. So the vacancy to values was, I think, a well-intentioned effort at trying to address sort of vacant properties. But again, it's about scale and being able to do it at a large enough amount, and a number of houses at the same time to get the financing to do the things like the lead paint remediation that go along with that.
Mike, did you have anything to add to that from your experience with Chesapeake?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is one of the things that we try to do at Habitat was, is there a way that you can pre-qualify buyers as a group ahead of building any houses? So oftentimes you build the houses and you're trying to figure out how, so like in Howard County, for example, I see $500,000, $600,000 houses going up, and there's a population to buy them. But in Baltimore, houses sit vacant because there isn't that there. If we focused on the front end and preparing families and got them pre-qualified by banks, figured out what the subsidy would be, you could actually work with a St. Ambrose or a Habitat and revitalize entire neighborhoods. Now imagine if we did that as a community with immigrants, with ex-offenders, and if we did it, if a mayor convened people together, we could create dramatic change. So part of this is a networking problem as much as it is, a capital problem from the supply side.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. And I know we're close to the end, but I did want to, there's another question here that I wanted to get to, which is about intergenerational housing. There's the question was that the story that was told by GERARD was really very fascinating. And there's clearly a need for seniors and parents who may be toward the end of life having a need for help. And besides the St. Ambrose home sharing, are there any other models, ideas? Is anything happening? Is St. Ambrose the best model to turn to? So what do you all know, or can you add to that discussion?
So I'll start. We're trying to rally around a concept called legacy housing and legacy homeowners. And it brings legal services and repair services to a senior who is living within a home that they own. And then if they are interested in passing it on to a family member, we make the means by creating a will, helping them to get a will and pass that asset on to that individual. We think it's beneficial both to the family, for the individual who currently live there, as well as for someone who will take over that home and is committed to that neighborhood and has that neighborhood pride and want to be part of that neighborhood. And it's being approached not from a traditional sense of how we produce housing stock, but in a way that doesn't involve the subsidy provision, the subsidy challenge of raising, getting those dollars into the unit, but it is a way of passing that asset on to a family member, and that family member can be committed to living in that neighborhood or in that house. Mm-hmm. We also think it's a good way for the private sector to get involved, because if you think about it, that individual who receives that asset from a family member now has a discount or a subsidy on the cost of the house built in. Mm-hmm. And that individual can now become the mortgage holder and create life into the house. So I think we need more programs like that, or at least not necessarily programs, but thinking about housing very differently. And we're utilizing it using legal services and a small amount of repair dollars. And then once you get that family who has some level of income, accessing the house without having down payments and all those other challenges with it, they have a better chance of living in the house for a long time and preserving the neighborhood. Those type of activities need to take shape, and we want more innovation around housing and ideas of how to sustain neighborhoods and sustain the asset and create better homeowners within our community.
Well,
yeah, and I would say, as a follow-up on that, the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service has a program, and they may be coordinating with St. Ambrose on, they call it the My Home, My Deed, My Legacy program, right, which is sort of similar in trying to help homeowners secure quiet title that they have for their property as they age.
Well, and I want to say, I think we've achieved our goal this evening. We started out, you may remember, with two goals. One was to get a better understanding of the enormity of the affordable housing problem. If anything, I've been working in this most of my life. It's still enormous. And we've got an idea of the incredible patchwork of problems that we face. But we also, I think, are left with some encouragement. I mean, the wisdom that was shared by Mike and GERARD and Amy was extraordinary. We are so grateful for the time you devoted to the presentations and to sharing your stories and to giving us encouraging words about how we can help and not to give up hope, to dare to dream for housing for all. I mean, we are better because of what you shared this evening. Before I turn it back to Nora for a quick windup, I want to thank you for your incredible contributions this evening. Thank everybody. I think the best test of how compelling this presentation was is that we still have the same number of people now that we had when we started 7 o'clock. So you were compelling and kept everyone here. And I just want to close with one small thought before I turn it over to Nora. And that was that today, when I was doing the reading at church, one of the prayers offered at the petitions was this prayer, which it just was out of the blue, but I think was so apt. It's a prayer that goes like this. We pray for all those without a home, those who are in fear of losing their home, and we pray for those who strive to relieve them of this burden. And that means the people here, Mike and Gerard and Amy and all the people on this virtual meeting, all of us committed to trying to relieve the problem of homelessness and provide a home for people who need a home. Let us pray to the Lord. So Nora, I turn it back to you.
Oh, Paul, thank you so much. And thanks to our rich presenters. I'll just add my gratitude. I want to just close tonight to say that we heard a lot about digging deep and advocating. And so you can kind of think of it as at the national level, we've got to fill the buckets and disperse funding and creative solutions that'll trickle down to states and local governments. And so we encourage you to think about joining Catholic Charities USA in their advocacy work. Obviously, there's a lot of HUT and a lot of money at stake right now. The National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And then Amy added another one. Thank you, Amy. The National Low Income Housing Coalition. These will come to you in a follow-up email as well as this recording. Now, on the other end of this, we've got some local organizations thinking about what are these creative solutions like Luminus, St. Ambrose, et cetera. And at the level of building power and advocating, we have our local Industrial Areas Foundation organization, Build in the city of Path in Howard County. There's 4 IAF organizations in the state of Maryland. So we're lucky enough to have 2 organizations that build power and advocate to make sure that the poor and are housed and immigrants are housed. Also, 2 organizations you're familiar with, Beyond the Boundaries, is absolutely worth mentioning, and the Maryland Catholic Conference. So links to these organizations will be included in a follow-up email. And that's all I'll say on that. I just kind of show you on the level of Catholic Charities USA has 2 statements out as of November 5th going into Congress around the appropriations bills that are hot right now and literally right now going through Congress, out of the House and going to the Senate. And so you can find those statements on their website and then physically advocate on their website, electronically through their system. So encourage you to visit that and do that, and I will include that in the email. Thank you.
And I think now we turn. Thank you, Nora. And so look out for that email. It'll be a rich source of information. And if you want to get back in touch with either Luminus or St. Ambrose, that information will be there too. And to close out the evening, we turn to Elaine, our spiritual director, for a closing prayer.
So we pray, Mother of exiles, shelter of the homeless, we are in need of your mercy. We ask your blessing on your children everywhere who are in danger today. Bless all who suffer from injustice. Shelter them in the warmth of your love and safeguard them from evil that rages around them. Turn our hearts, our eyes, and our hearts to their needs and give us courage to act for their good. We ask this relying on your compassion and confident of your love. Amen.
Amen.
So Nora, you're going to finish up by telling us about Thursday too, right?
Oh, yeah, I'll let you know. Thursday is our IVC information session for incoming volunteers. I can include that in the email. And then we have future Theology Uncorked, one in March and June. And one will focus on the environment and the other on youth in and around the city. So join us, come back. Thank you all for being here.
And thanks to our speakers, just wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Have a good
Take
night,
care.
everybody.
Have a safe night. Good night and thanks
Good night,
again.
everyone.
God bless you, everyone.
God bless you, Gerard.
Bye.